Hey listeners, I want to tell you about the 34th PASA Sustainable Agriculture Conference happening February 5th through 7th in Lancaster, PA. You can register at pasafarming.org/HRN. That's PASA farming.org/HRN. This conference draws a diverse group of rural and urban farmers, educators, advocates, entrepreneurs, community groups, artisans, researchers, policymakers, home cooks and gardeners, youth, and others for 3 days of learning on sustainable agriculture and food systems topics. I went last year and I had a blast and I learned so much. So don't miss more than 80 educational sessions and an expansive trade show. Again, you can learn more and register at pasafarming.org/HRN.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We've been making cheese in Wisconsin since before we were even a state, which may be one reason why we win so many awards for it. It's what happens when a whole state dreams in cheese. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Dan Keeling. We'll talk to Dan about wine, of course, his new book, and more. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Music man turned wine man, Dan Keeling left the record biz to pursue his love of wine. That after getting bored signing Coldplay. Dan has changed the way we read about wine, co-founding and editing Noble Rot magazine. Dan, along with his partner Mark Andrew, own 3 award-winning Noble Rot restaurants, imports wine through his Keeling Andrew Wine Company, and brings wine to the people from Shrine to the Vine, his retail outlet, all in London, England. Dan just wrote his second book. I think it's his second book. I know there's 2. Who's Afraid of Romane Conte? A Shortcut to Drinking Great Wines. Welcome back to the Grape Nation, Dan.
Hey, Sam. Thanks for having me back.
All right, we're talking to Dan remotely via our Zencaster app. Dan, where are you right now?
I'm in Lamb's Conduit Street in Bloomsbury in London, upstairs in my office above our first restaurant. It's pretty cold, but I understand it might have been snowing in New York, right?
It's pretty cold here, too. It's like 8 degrees. So you're upstairs at the first Noble Rot, is what you're saying?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I work out of here every day, and that's where I base most of the magazine operations.
Nice. All right, so we got a chance to talk to Dan and his friend, partner, co-author of their first book, Mark Andrews. It was back in October of 21, Dan. That's like a little under 4 years ago. We talked about Noble Rot, Wine from Another Galaxy, a really big, thick, interesting, terrific book, still on my bookshelf. And you're back, and I reached out to you when I saw your book, Who's Afraid of Romane Conte? And I got a chance to read it, and I thought you should come back on and talk about it. All right, so we're going to talk a lot about the book and what's in it. But before, because you've been around wine so much, I want to get your take on a bunch of things. So you've been at this for quite a while as a publisher, editor, as a restaurant wine bar owner, as a retailer, as an importer. You pretty much cover, everything except maybe making wine. And you've been doing this for many years. So you've had a front row seat to wine through all your outlets. Tell me about some of the changes, surprises, good things that through all of this you've seen in wine through the years. And maybe by how you selected who's in the book, that explains some of it too. But tell me some of the things through these years about wine that you've recognized.
Yeah, I mean, the last 10 years or so, since we started the magazine, I mean, wine has been undergoing this huge wave of change. So, in many ways, it's probably the best time ever to have started a wine magazine or fanzine. There's so many things and so many topics that we've covered in the magazine and I cover in the book. From I remember, starting out and at that time getting into wine was pretty much dominated still by kind of Robert Parker scores and by Bordeaux.
Right.
And also around that same time was the kind of first roots of natural wine and some of the really interesting producers kind of coming through and selling their wines in the UK. So I was really exposed to the kind of uber traditional chateau, but then also the very kind of iconoclastic kind of producers getting back to very traditional ways of making wines without any kind of chemicals at all. And those two things, those two ideologies were at kind of completely different ends of the wine spectrum. And what's kind of really interested now is how they've kind of, both of them have kind of moved a little bit back towards the center ground.
Right.
The conversation about natural wine is much more nuanced than maybe it was before, and how maybe some people within that kind of movement are less. They won't accept kind of mediocrity or badly made wine
Right.
anymore.
I want
Whereas the
to.
book,
I
yeah,
want to talk to you about natural wine in a minute, but finish your thought. I'm sorry.
yeah, and the Bordelais, obviously, there's kind of new things going on there. There's producers and chateau like Le Carme, Haut-Brion, which are doing very interesting things. Uh,
Right.
them in particular are using whole bunch, which is kind of unheard of recently in
Yeah.
Bordeaux. But it's kind of it's reinvention, and life reinvents itself all the time. Wine reinvents itself all the time. So that's been really interesting. I've seen, Burgundy was my partner Mark and I's kind of first love that we bonded over. And, you've seen the steep ascent of many wines and how they kind of spiked in how much they cost during lockdown. And that is now recorrecting in the market, which is, I think, a good thing for drinkers.
Yeah.
Um,
We're
and
going to
then you
talk about that too,
and then
because
all
you
these, yeah, sorry, carry on.
no, because you talk about different aspects of Burgundy, which I want people to buy the book for that, but I also want you to talk about it. So
Yeah. And then all these other re-emerging wine regions rather than just emerging. So, places, Spain as a whole, I think, is one of the most interesting countries out of all over the last 10 years. All these regions, Gredos Mountains, Ribera Sacra, New School Sherry.
right.
There's been so much reinvention going on there. Greek wine
Yep.
has been very, very interesting as well. So it's been this incredible time of change and positivity, I think, because one thing that I think we keep hearing a lot, and I know it might even be louder in America, is this anti-alcohol lobby and how people aren't drinking wine, people aren't interested in wine anymore. And whilst as a whole wine might be down, all I see around us in London and in our restaurants, with our staff, with our magazine readership, is this deep love and fascination of great wine. But I'm talking about a very different type of wine, of course, to the big brands that are making quite processed wines.
Right.
And I think it's time for people in wine as a whole to express their love of this culture. It's down to
I
us.
I totally agree. I had Eric Asimov on a couple of weeks ago, and not intentionally, but his tone was a little more negative because of the last few things that you mentioned,
Mm,
consumption, possibly tariffs and all of that. But one thing he pointed out, and I think you're validating, is that natural wines are not seeing a dip in consumption. They're
mm.
not, they're actually holding on or growing a little, which is a nice thing, and hopefully supports um, all the efforts. I Based on a few things you said, I just wanted to ask you some stuff. When you started Noble Rot, was the internet much of a thing, or was wine still really a handful, of outlets, like you mentioned, Parker and all the other stuff? I mean, had the internet democratized wine enough by then?
But I think, Parker, his newsletter, which turned into his website,
Right.
that benefited a lot from being online. And I think, when I really got into wine, like 2007 or 2008, I'm sure that that was online,
Yeah.
but I think social media was maybe a little bit behind that. I mean, if I try and cast my mind back to that time, I was 2006. I was still working at record labels, and we would be sent band demos, or we would check out band demos by MySpace, which is kind of like
Right.
a precursor of
Right.
Facebook or whatever. So I think there certainly wasn't Instagram, and I think Instagram has been a game changer for wine.
Yeah.
Having that window into what other people are drinking around the world, and how it's made some wines real cult bottles that people have searched after. How it's affected and changed wine culture has been quite profound.
Yeah. Um, and since then, it's been pretty crazy. I'm just curious, what was the compulsion, with all the direction in your life and, liking and love towards wine? Why do you sit down and say, I'm going to publish literally a magazine? I mean, it's still a real magazine, and it's online, right?
Mm. Yeah, I
Why
mean,
do what did you need the outlet? There was no competition. People weren't covering it well.
well, there was
Passion.
certainly there's still magazines now, but they're very different in terms of they carry a lot of advertising. They're glossy. They're not so kind of based around artwork. Maybe well, they have
Right.
artwork. It's just not particularly well thought out a lot of the time, or expressive. They're quite commercial, is what I mean to say.
Right.
But even when I was back at school and primary school, I used to make comics with one of my best friends. So I've always had this kind of fascination with print. And then when I went to university, I got involved with the Manchester Metropolitan University's magazine, and I was writing about music for that. And one of the things that I love about music, rather not music writing, um, rather than just the process, which I absolutely adore, but is how it kind of opens doors that would kind of remain shut. So when I was trying to get into A&R, I would, I'd write about music for Melody Maker, which was, like
Sure.
Enemy, and then a few other kind of publications. And that really opened the doors to record labels, and that's how I kind of moved forward in that career. And with wine, I knew I wanted to be involved with wine and food, but I didn't know how. So I just kind of went back to what I know, which is writing, and it's kind of spiraled from there. And there was a big opportunity with wine publications to do something a bit different, also
Right.
to contextualize wine with all the other things that wine lovers usually love,
Right.
films, books, music, food, restaurants.
All
And I
very,
guess,
all
yeah,
very, topics that really get you.
yeah, if you're into using your senses, you're
Right.
into using your
Sensory
senses, and
topics.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I guess I don't want to use kind of generalizations like lifestyle publications and terms like that, but it's kind of is a kind of lifestyle thing. It's a kind of when you're into wine. I mean, there's different levels of being into wine, and I think maybe you and me, Sam, are probably deeper in it than most people, but people love a kind of window onto to this kind of fascinating world,
Yeah.
and it's such a beautiful métier to be able to be part of.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't know if it was in the book or just doing research. I stumbled upon a story, and tell me if it's true and tell me more about it. That as your eyes were opening to wine, you and your wife enrolled in a wine class and a cooking class just because of curiosity. And is that all true? And did that have any kind of major effect?
Yeah, so that's kind of chapter one in the book. Who's Afraid of Romany Conti? We got together. We were early 30s, and we moved in together. And when you see that kind of the next chapter of your life unfolding, and you think that's children, that's family, that's settling
Right.
down. In my 20s, I was an A&R guy with an expense account. So I
Right.
managed to kind of eat out pretty much every night and in some pretty great restaurants. And
Uh-huh.
then I thought, well, that's not going to happen. So do I want to live on takeaways for the rest of my life, or do I teach myself and find out how to cook, how to chop an onion? All these things that, you take for granted now. But
Right.
I think in schools they should teach people properly how to cook because it's such a great life
Right.
skill. But for so many people in certainly in Britain, and I don't know about America,
Same.
don't necessarily have those skills. So that was a really good course at Leaf's Cookery School, which is a very famous one here in West London.
Right.
And then from there, there was the Christie's wine course with Stephen Spurrier and Michael Broadbent, which
But you
they
didn't
couldn't.
know they were the instructors initially, right? I mean, that was a home
No,
run after the fact.
yeah, I mean, they were just two kind of pretty old school English gents, and they were going pretty deep on the kind of information about harvests, especially for a kind of very kind of beginner class. Talking about how in April it was raining, and then it kind of into summer it was warm, and everyone was like trying to stick with it. But I
Right.
remember having Trimback Riesling, just the entry level wine on the course, and I can kind of remember it now like it was yesterday because I'd smelt Riesling before, and so many people have smelt Riesling, obviously because it's such a popular wine or grape. But I'd never really be able to kind of put the how to just put the word Riesling next to it. So being able to identify that was kind of one big epiphany, and that's a wine that now I still would say, if somebody just wants to get into wine, they don't have a lot of money, I think you can pick that up for £12 in the UK, and it's a beautiful, well-made wine that tastes like what it should taste like. Tastes like Riesling from
So
Alsace.
let's talk about this for a second. When you were smelling Riesling early on, was it German Riesling or Alsatian Riesling? Because you're talking about Alsatian. Do you
That's
remember?
right. Yeah, what I meant was as somebody who knew nothing, next to nothing about
Right.
wine, I'd smelt that kind of petrolly smell,
Sure.
but
I can't get away from that.
I hadn't associated it with either Alsatian or German Riesling. I just kind of
Right.
knew
That's what I
that was,
figured,
yeah, yeah,
early
yeah.
on. That's one of the early chapters in the book. And just, while we're on it, let me ask you two questions. Um, you peg that as your gateway wine. I don't know if this is a question or you can answer it, but for people that enjoy wine, like you said, people not as well versed as us, and there are people that are even more well versed, but are interested in wine. Um, Define a gateway wine, and can you stumble on that? I mean, do people have hope that they'll come across that Alsatian Riesling? Does that just happen?
Well,
Or do you find it? How do you get to that gateway wine, which is the gateway?
Well, I mean, very simply, with that particular wine, that was from wanting to go on a course and find out more about wine, to get a basic grounding in it. So that's definitely one way. But I do think it's not just one gateway wine. It's just kind of this to stay interested in wine or to stay interested in like many different things in life, it's kind of like constant little kind of reminders of how amazing it can be at its best. So I remember having a Polini Montrachet then a few months later by Olivier Leflevre, which again just was like,
Sure.
just another kind of eye opener. Or drinking Condria for the first time, which was one of the Gigal kind of negociant bottling. So it was something I bought in the supermarket, and then from there, then you progress to more kind of smaller producers, and I think even now it's always about chasing after that next kind of epiphany of
So
that.
you're pointing towards obviously being inquisitive
Mm.
and taste, taste, taste. Try, try, try. You see something, try it. You're with friends, try it. You're in a right.
I think it's the under the next cork. It's not knowing what's under the next cork. It's unpredictable, and that's one of the things that makes wine interesting. Because if it was predictable, and actually maybe I should kind of rephrase that a bit, because a lot of wine is predictable. That's like the vast majority of it has kind of been processed and processed to be consistent. but it
Right.
doesn't really have these huge highs. It might not have so many lows either, but
Right.
that's kind of what I'm after. I guess I'm a thrill seeker when it comes to wine. I don't
So,
necessarily want consistency if it means I'm losing flavor and
well,
an amazing
I,
experience.
I totally agree, and we're going to talk about that. I just wrote down, and I don't know if you've written this down in any of the books or in the magazine, but I just wrote down what you just said, which is not knowing what is under the next cork. Have you
Yeah.
written or uttered those words before?
I have just written it in an article for the next magazine,
Okay.
actually.
I mean, it's a great statement.
Yeah.
All right. So let me move towards something keep bringing up. And it's natural wines, and I'll
Mm,
explain in a second. So I want to get your take on a few things. I've been doing this podcast. I think we're going into our 8th or 9th year, going back to 2016. That's through the podcast I began to understand and drink more natural wines.
mm,
Sort of like you alluded earlier when you started the magazine and everything. But for some silly reason, I always wrestled with defining what natural wine, is, which has been a waste of time. What I like is the way you refer to these wines in the book and probably all other times as living wines.
mm.
And I think that'll explain itself when we talk about it. I've kind of moved towards calling them thoughtful wines, which kind of falls under the same, umbrella. And one thing I
Yeah.
noticed, and you just sort of said it, is basically every winemaker you talk about in the book is a living wine in some way or another.
Mm.
So I'm not looking to define natural wine, but to you, and this isn't a definition, what is a living wine?
So a living wine is one that hasn't been kind of, processed in like industrially processed, like most wine has. That I'm I'll repeat kind of what I said earlier about this
No,
thing
no, it's
about
that's
going for consistency above all else.
right,
So a living wine is something that's been kind of allowed to be itself. I remember Josko Gravner talking about that. A wine is just to allow it to become what it's going to become without kind of adding all these other chemicals or tannins or acidity or whatever else gets added to a lot of commercial
manipulation.
wine.
Right,
Manipulated, yeah.
right,
So a lot of those wines, they end up as kind of lifeless as a pint of UHT milk. There's nothing
right,
of interest there. So for a living wine, I mean, it's kind of people use the term low intervention, and I guess what we're kind of getting at, or what they're getting at, is it's a bit like when you're cooking. If you've got really great ingredients, some of the most beautiful food that you're ever going to have is just been kind of haven't been touched a lot of times. There hasn't been like loads and loads of processes to turn it
right,
into something else. So it's going back to that cliche of, great wine is made in the vineyard, but from all that I've seen, that is certainly true. And then if people can get great fruit and handle it in a very kind of sympathetic way, that's how you make a wine that can evolve over time. But that is a generalization as well, because at the restaurant, we have a lot of old Bordeaux's, we have a lot of old, vintages of champagnes like Krug. And,
right,
Krug has been processed many, many times, but it's still a great wine. So it's a very nuanced conversation.
right.
But I want the highs, so I'm willing to kind of put up with some of the lows. It's just the kind of the mediocrity in the middle that is it just becomes about alcohol for me then, and it's not that interesting.
But the crazy thing to me is that the majority of what the world drinks, is this process manipulated wine, right? I
Yeah.
mean, cheaper wines, jug wines, box wines, even famous, I'm not going to say names, famous Napa cabs or even some Bordeaux's are so, you know, herbicide, pesticide processed and all of that. Um,
Mm,
it's kind of sad that that's what most people drink. And even some of the thoughtful wines, are hard to get. But also, you talk about, farming and the way these people make these wines. I mean, this is a category where the wine goes beyond the glass. I mean, this is really about people, right? And the
Yeah.
farm and the culture. Talk to me a little about that, because God knows you've spoken to enough of these people.
Well, yeah, just I don't know why Grafner keeps popping into my mind, but one thing he said
For a good
is,
reason.
yeah, one thing I remember him saying to me was, young winemakers they should just as well go on a philosophy course as they would go on a winemaking course, because that's kind of really where great wine comes from. And also
So that's
about
the perfect example of, wine goes beyond the juice in the glass.
yeah,
You kind of
but
have to have this whole,
yeah.
thought philosophical process.
But what are you setting out to do? What is it do you want to make? And what are the reasons? What are the kind of the principles as well? Also, I think the best winemakers that I've met have all been, or my favorite winemakers I've met, I should rephrase that, they've all tasted a lot of other wines. They're all very curious about other wines, and I think that you've kind of got to have experienced some of the amazing wines, whether that's been from Bordeaux or Burgundy, or in Brunello or Champagne, and you've kind of got to know what is possible to kind of to make really great wine. So
Yeah,
there's kind of they have that in common.
right.
um, and they are willing to kind of put quality number one. I mean, obviously they want their businesses to thrive, but it's kind of like with a lot of business, and not just commercial wine, but business owners per se. It's all about profit, and then you work backwards from there. Whereas I think these kind of dreamers, as I call them in the book, they dream of making their ultimate wine, and that they know they've only got one life, and they want to be the best they can. And I think if you do make something that is great, then the commercial side normally clicks into place. But they're certainly not kind of about marketing, or I don't know.
No, it's a very interesting proposition, with these guys, because they're farmers, they're winemakers, they're rural. I mean, their
Yeah,
first love, like you said, is making the wine, and they kind of do
yeah.
move backwards and figure it out.
They're more like artists. And
Yeah, perfect way to.
with our import company, I just it reminds me so much of music, and music management. And when I start talking about
How?
winemakers, I normally just say artists instead of winemakers by accident, because a lot of, I mean, not all of the winemakers are like this, but certainly quite a few of them. They approach what they do as an art form, and on the level that they do it, it's not just agriculture. Once you add agriculture to philosophy, it's agriculture plus philosophy, and it becomes something that's kind of it's magical. As we know, that's why we're in wine. It's something that you can drink that can just take you to a completely different place, like great art does, like great music does. So I
It's
think
right in
it's
that, like you said,
yeah,
sensory category. Um,
yeah,
Tell me if you agree with this. What you've just talked about. There's an abundance of great artists, aka great winemakers. Um, Through the years, I think passionate people like you and many others that we know have done a sincere job in bringing these wines to different places. Certainly in the U.S. My friend Stephen Bitteroff has brought great German wines to the
mm,
U.S. Jenny Lefcourt, has brought natural wines for many years. Um, that's an important part of the process of helping these guys pay the rent, right?
yeah.
I mean, your import company. Just tell me a little about it. I mean, what are you doing? You've found producers that haven't been represented in England and maybe other places, and you've brought them in?
Yeah, I mean, we started off our first ever person domain that we worked with was Jean-Marc Rouleau. So he had been represented for many years, but he wanted to leave his importer. And we'd become friends, and we were buying cellars on the continent, and we were kind of importing those wines. But he said, who would you recommend importer wise? And I kind of went through a few different thoughts on that and options, and he wasn't really into any of them. So I said, well, how about we do it? So it was such a kind of a leap of faith for him to trust Mark and I to represent his wines in the UK. But it built from there. And I think at the time I equated it to like having Radiohead on your record label. When you
Right.
have somebody that's like that, who's a star at what they do, it attracts other people. And from there, we've kind of built over the last few years. I mean, we started in 2017.
So the
And
Rouleau story goes back to 17?
yeah, that's
Okay.
when we started with Jean-Marc. And then, we've added some amazing producers in Burgundy. And recently, we've picked up people like Manuel Gibourg and Freddie Mounier, who for me, Freddie
Sure.
Mounier was like the greatest. Like that's really why I got into Burgundy was discovering Freddie Mounier wine. So, but then also this kind of young generation of Burgundians, people like Cassiope or Camille
Dan,
Thierry.
Dan, stop right there because I want to talk. I really want to get into depth with Burgundy.
Mm.
We have to take a break. Um, when we come back, I want to talk about the book, and I want to talk about the topics and chapters of which that's one which will really expand. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I really want to get deep into it. So we're going to take a quick break. We're talking to Dan Keeling. Dan just wrote his new book, Who's Afraid of Romany Conti. When we get back, we're going to get into that and a bunch of things I rudely interrupted Dan on.
Not at all.
So you're listening to the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
All right, we're back. We're back with my guest, Dan Keeling. As I mentioned earlier, Dan has his hands in basically everything that covers wine. He's an importer, he's a retailer, he's a restaurant owner, he's a writer, he's a publisher. I didn't have this in my notes, but Dan, isn't like one of the last or few things not on that list making wine? Does that ever, tickle you a little to do that?
Oh, it's such a long-term proposition, and I'm in such awe of these winemakers that we work with and whose wines we drink. But I don't know. I'm maybe just too past it for that. I'm coming up to 50, and I think it takes so long to perfect your craft, no matter what you're doing, and you only have one chance every year to do it as a winemaker. And besides, I haven't got any vineyards, so it's not
That's
something's going
Dan.
to happen.
That's a mature logical answer. But to that point, you've collaborated and you have collaboration wines in the restaurants, right? I mean, you've sort of gotten your hand into it one way or another. Is that true?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Chin Chin, our house wine, that's a kind of collaboration. It's a Vina Verde. I mean, as I write about in the book, the holy grail as a restaurateur is finding a cheap wine that's delicious that you want to drink yourself. And it took a long time of searching, a lot of the time in Portugal, actually, because there's lots of good value in Portugal to find
Great.
it. But
Great.
it's your kind of badge of honor as a restaurateur to have good house wines. So, yeah, that's a collaboration. And during lockdown, we had one of our illustrators from the magazine, Jose Mendez. He designed a really beautiful label for it. And it kind of, people presume it's a natural wine. And, you know, we were selling this wine to shops and other restaurants as well as it being our house wine in Noble Rock. And they would advertise it as natural wine. And we would say, this is not a natural wine. I mean, it's kind of, it is as well made as you're going to get at this price
Right.
point, really. But it's not natural. But
Right.
it was a huge hit, and the name kind of you know was part of that as well. And Chin Chin was something that we write a lot in the magazine and sign off. The introduction,
Right.
Chin Chin. It's just a kind of old English thing that my mate Mick used to say all the time, still does. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing the label. It's a fun label for sure. All right, let's talk about the book. All right. So I always do this. Let me get the book vitals out of the way. All right. Answer these questions.
Yeah.
So why did you decide to write this book? You had written a book, you publish a magazine. Why? How does the idea of this particular book come together?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of voyage of discovery as I describe it, and I wanted to kind of talk about everything from how we go about finding Chin Chin, a really good
Right.
house wine, but also what does it feel like to taste which is supposed to be, the most fabled wine in the world, Romani Conti. And I think that every wine lover will kind of have their fantasies about
Right.
what these wines are going to feel like to taste. And I kind of then wanted to do a guide to everything else in between. It goes from cheap wine to right the way to the top. And I didn't think, well, at the time when I came up with the title, I didn't think I'd get invited to this amazing tasting at Domaine de la Romani Conti.
You were at
Which
the official Romani tasting?
So it was a tasting that was put on by Aubert de Villaine, and
Okay, that's his.
it, it was to reprise the book about Romani Conti written by the legendary Richard Olney. And,
Right.
in that book, which came out I think it was the 90s, there's a tasting at the end of it, and it's got people like Michael Broadbent and Serena Sutcliffe and Michel Bertin and a few others, probably a table of 8 people. And they do this most amazing Romani Conti tasting, like going back like a century.
Oh, wow.
So he wanted to update that, but he didn't have those vintages anymore because they were just too rare. So what he said he would do is do the last 25 vintages of Romani Conti, and I met
Not
these.
too shabby, right?
Well, you'll take that, won't you?
Yes.
And
Take
I'd met these filmmakers called Frank and Varane at a award show in Paris, for a restaurant award show a few years prior to it. And Frank came in the restaurant one day and said, "Do you want to come to this tasting of Romani Conti?" And I thought he was completely mental, just some crazy guy off the street in Soho. But he wasn't. He was legit. And this tasting kept getting put into the diary and then taken out because it was, following COVID. And I really didn't know if it was going to happen. But it was kind of, there's that book, isn't there, called The Secret, which was a hit like years ago. I remember a friend of mine talking to me about it. And the premise of it is if you want something enough, the universe is going to give it to you. So I don't know if coming up with that title had anything to do with it. So I ended up at this crazy tasting, and it's a once in a lifetime thing. As in, when are you ever going to get to actually not just taste Romani Conti? Because a lot of people are very lucky in the trade to be able to go to the Domaine de la Romani Conti tasting every year, where you get a very small measure of it.
Right.
But to say that you've tasted a wine properly, I think you really have to have drunk it, and drunk a few glasses and to do it over multiple vintages was just was an amazing experience. So I wanted the book to go from the very bottom of what we do to the very top. And then throughout the book, it's interspersed, and probably what makes it very different to Wine from Another Galaxy, our Noble Rock book, was there's just a lot more recommendations of things you can buy. So, if
At
you're
the end of
starting
each
out,
chapter is,
yeah,
a serious list of recommendations, winemakers, specifics.
exactly. So I think back to myself in 2007, and if I'd have had this book, I think I would have been able to hear some of these fabulous stories that bring alive wine culture, which is really kind of the thing that still keeps pulling me back in. And then once I'd kind of understand where these wines come from, who they're made by, what the context of them are, then I can just I could get on Wine Searcher and buy a few bottles and experience it. And I
Right.
think it's enabling people to explore. But I think, one of my, going back to this guy, Mick, who was saying, he says, chin chin, he's like my uncle. He's not my actual uncle, but he is my
Right.
uncle, if you know what I mean. And he was he's such a good storyteller. And he'd come around my house and we'd have dinner, and then he'd say, have you heard of Hermitage? Have you heard of Chave Hermitage? And the hermits, and then he'd tell a story about it. And I'd be like, stories are what hooks you into wine. And
Right.
that's kind of what this book is about. It's about stories, but so is
So
Noble Rot. It's built on stories.
that's how you want people to use the book. When I ask you, how do you want people to use the book? They're intrigued by our talk and they want to go out and get the book. How should they
Yeah.
use it to explore and educate themselves more?
Exactly. I'm going to these places first. The first-hand observations and stories from these areas. Yellow wine is another wine that I'm infatuated with. Yellow wine.
Vin how do you pronounce it?
Yeah, Vin jaune. Yeah, I
Vin
just
jaune.
think it's an incredible wine. But it's such a niche wine.
Mm,
It's made in oak barrels. Some of it evaporates out because it's not topped up, and this the film of yeast kind of forms over the top, and it protects it over the 6 years and 3 months that it takes before you can release it by law. But it kind of develops these crazy flavors, and how do you get that information if you don't read about it?
right.
There's only so many ways to learn, and I kind of want to just pass on some of these stories to people so it can help light their kind of infatuation with wine as well, because it's such a beautiful thing to be able
Yeah.
to be in. And
You
I
know,
know that not everyone can be in it because there is barriers to entry with wine, which is one of the few things I don't like about it, which it costs a lot of money to buy good wine. Well, it can do. You can also buy good cheap wine, but it's about passing on stories, and it'd
right.
be a real shame if stories don't get passed on. But that's what your podcast about. That's what kind of good wine media is about.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Just quickly, when did you start the book? How long did it take to write?
Well, I started it after we put out Wine from Another Galaxy in 2020, so it probably took 3 years. I mean, it was.
But did you have the clarity, like, okay, I'm starting on my next book because I like it and I have this idea? Was it that simple?
Yeah, I mean, it's just I'm always writing. I'm always
Okay,
trying to
right.
think of what is it. I just kind of I want to go somewhere. Like I'm trying to get our new magazine to the printers next week, but I'm plotting where to go next. There's so
New,
many amazing
new,
places to go.
new, um, what am I trying to say? Not a new, different than Noble Rock, just the latest edition is what
The
you mean,
latest
right? Yeah,
edition,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Okay, I
yeah.
thought, oh, this guy's nuts. He's starting another magazine. Um,
It's a
you're
cheese
nuts, but
magazine.
not that nuts. All right, so we can't discuss the multitude of topics and wines discussed in all the chapters of the book because there's so
Yeah.
many. So that's why I had you on to pique people's interest and go out and buy the book. But we can talk about a few of them. So I have a
Mm.
bunch of things, I want to ask you about. And please, and you've been like you just Van Dijon, you just, we've Spain. Just feel free at any point, to discuss everything.
Mm.
I do want to talk to you about Burgundy. I told you that earlier. It's become very costly. It's become very inaccessible.
Mm.
In chapter 8, It's called It's Just Begun. You talk about some new growers, regions, and wines, that are approachable and accessible, and more
Yeah.
importantly, just plain good. Um, Talk to me about, and you were about to get into it. That's why I stopped you. Talk to me about some of these specific winemakers and the regions and all that. Because in the chapter that precedes it, you talk about greatness comes from unexpected places,
Mm.
and lower ranking appellations. So tie that all together and let's give people, a little primer on being able to drink great Burgundy without being an elitist like you and going to Romani Conti tastings.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to talk about Burgundy without seeming like you're elitist or privileged or,
No,
all that.
you got the
It's
cred
true.
on this. Help my listeners.
It is true, but there is another side of Burgundy, which is, this new generation of growers. And I think as these amazing Grand Crus have doubled and trebled and quadrupled in price and became, so far detached from what normal your average person can afford, there is also these great kind of, a lot of them are, I say younger, but some of them are probably my age as well, that are
Right.
making beautiful wines in lesser appellations where they're not kind of bargain bucket kind of prices, but they're
Right.
they're they're, they're
Compared,
affordable.
though. Right.
Yeah, so when you think of people like Sylvain Patay in Marcenay, who's been making beautiful wines for years, or I think of Morange as an appellation in the
But
south of Burgundy.
Dan, take a second.
Yeah,
People go, Marcenay, what's that? Morange, what's that? These are some of the appellations, that are not central to Burgundy, Côte de Beaune, Côte de Nuit. Tell me, just describe a little of, that. Patel is
yeah.
the master of Marzenay, but what is Marzenay?
Well, Marthenay is just outside of Dijon. So if you were kind of thinking, for those listeners who have been to London, if you're looking at a tube map of London and you think, Nuit Saint Georges and Von Romanet are kind of like Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Circus, then, Marthenay right at the top of the Northern Line, you've got that there on the outskirts, some suburb that probably nobody really cares, a bit unloved, but nobody cares so much
Right.
about. And then down Marcenay, you've got that it right on the south, down on the other end of the Northern Line, and that's like the last village in the before you get to the Côte de Chalonnais, in the Côte de Beaune, and it was this it was looked down upon for many years as this place where the grapes were kind of good enough to go into kind of generic bottlings, but the tannins were a bit kind of rustic and square, and sometimes they still can be now. But because we've had this kind of the effects of climate change, and because the vineyards were kind of affordable for younger winemakers, there's been a real kind of improvement in some of the wines down there. So there's a young couple called Tallulah and Hugo who do Domaine Cassiopée, and they've worked at some of the great domains of France and Switzerland. Tallulah worked for Chapaz in the Valais, and Hugo worked for Jean-Marc Rouleau, also worked for Freddie Mounier, and that's how we came to work with them. They make beautiful wines, very honest, authentic. And just down the road, there's another winery that we've just started working with called Bachelet Mono. And,
Sure.
3 weeks ago, I think Mark and I went to taste there, and we were just blown away by these wines. If Morange has got this reputation for rusticity, these red wines and the whites, but the red wines especially, they were just kind of they were silky like finest Volnay. So just really exciting, these kind of out there appellations and the best people or some of our favorite people in them are very exciting. But I could go on. I mean, Camille Thirier in Côte de Nuit Village, another very humble appellation.
Thiriet is Thiriet.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah,
Yeah, because my
and
people listen and they go, "What did he say?" They want to look it up or buy it.
I got a dodgy English accent as well. So, but yeah, Camille Thirier, those wines are worth checking out. They have a real sensuality to them, and going back to the philosophy of winemakers, knowing that what kind of wines they want to make. Do they want to make more generous wines, sensual wines? And that's the style that we love at Noble Rot. And this is the kind of producers that make it in Burgundy.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, these are not inexpensive wines, but relative to all the other stuff out there, the quality to value is, terrific. Bachelet, Monet. I mean, I was lucky enough, and I think they do a pretty good job. Grand Cru Selection did their tasting not that long ago, and a lot of these people we're talking about line the walls. So it was fun to taste all of that. So Marsanne, Morange. What about some more white wines? I mean, Aligote. I mean, are there?
Yeah, I mean, Aligote has obviously been, had a real kind of growth in interest, and I think Sylvain Petai especially has been instrumental in that. That
Yes.
he's really pushed Aligote and single vineyard Aligotes, but as was proven by Domaine d'Auvergne, which is Lalou Bise Loire's Aligote,
Right.
which is now goes for astronomical prices. It's no longer the humble grape that it once was.
Right.
But when you talk to Sylvain about Aligote, he'll talk about how a century ago, 150 years ago, it was co-planted with Chardonnay in some of the best spots in the region. So its wines. It was regarded as a kind of great field blend. That kind of combination, and then it's kind of got more relegated to some of the lesser spots, and that's why it was kind of sometimes could be a bit thin and a bit kind of nondescript. But it's all about how people treat what they're growing and how they make the wine. So it's But for all Burgundy is now being criticised, or there's a backlash against the prices, which I completely understand. It's so complex and there's so many different things going on there that you can't just write it off as one thing or another.
That's one podcast on its own. That part of Burgundy, like almost like nowhere else. It's just crazy. But people shouldn't have to get caught up with that. All right, I want to talk to you about another chapter and a wine I love, and I know you do. I'm a big Northern Rhone guy. Chapter 21, the chapter's called Sainted Love. You talk about Northern wines. You key in a little in an area that is, everyone loves, Hermitage and all that. But I'm a huge Saint Joseph fan. I'm a huge Jean Gonan fan. He's been on the podcast. What is it about these wines, from Saint Joseph? And I think this is another example. It's not just what's in the glass.
Oh, wow. It's not, but it is. I think.
Oh, in the end,
I was thinking about. We were talking about Gonan here at Noble Rot last week, and that, for listeners that don't know it, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know Gonan because it is rightly a revered domain, but it's still, for the price. You're getting world-class wine that stands shoulder to shoulder with pretty much any other in the Northern Rhone, and it's still very affordable. But there's no wine that smells like that. It's this combination of violets and roasted
violets.
Yeah, it's one of those wines that makes you rub your head and think, how the hell does that come from grapes? It doesn't really smell like it comes from fruit. Probably I don't know. It's something that you probably find in a hedgerow or down a foxhole. I don't know. It's just amazing wine. But I say that in a really positive way. It's so visceral. It's so smoky. So animal, as the French say. So a really great.
But as
place
distinctive as anywhere, right? I mean,
and that's obviously these kind of wines, individuality and character. That's where it's at. No matter where a wine is from, it just needs to be individual. Right. And it's that homogenization of wine that is kind of, turns a lot of people off, and why a lot of people might think, if you've got an interest in wine, they think, oh, why are you interested in that? And why would you spend all that money and time and, obsessing about wine? But it's because of individuality and character.
Yeah. You talked earlier about Condro, which is from that region, right?
Yeah, I love that wine.
It's a What are some of the characteristics? Is Cointreau very florally on the nose, or am I
Yeah,
thinking?
floral, and you
It's a great
know,
white wine.
yeah, I love Conjure and I love White Hermitage, White
Yeah.
San Josef as well. Those Northern Rhone whites, they're so, well, people would call them gourmands. And what they mean by that is they're so textured, they can be so oily. I remember
Yes.
that going back to that first bottle of Conjure and just I could almost see the shape of it in my mind as I drank it. It was so voluptuous. But rather than just being voluptuous and flabby, it had this real bitterness, a freshness on the finish that cut through the fat. And it
Right.
was this kind of contradiction or this contrast that the greatest wines have. They're all a bit, the best, when you have like a great Latour or whatever, or an amazing red Burgundy, it's weightlessness but with density.
Right.
That
Right.
how does that happen?
Yeah, they
It's,
do a good
yeah,
job with that.
yeah,
I recently sat and did a podcast with Pascaline Lepeltier, truly,
mm,
one of my favorite people in wine. We talked about her new book, A Thousand Vines.
yeah,
Um, and I figured she was still fresh in my mind. And you did a chapter, and I think it was even an ode to her. Like you call the chapter Shannon, 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 which is really
yeah.
her battle cry.
Mm.
I thought it was interesting, and expand on this. You say it's one of your favorite white wines. Um, I think I know why, but tell me.
Yeah, I mean
People
it's one of
don't
my,
think of Shannon as much as you and I would like them to.
yeah, I think what I mean by that is, more often than not, if I'm at home and I'm thinking, what am I going to drink? And I love white wine as much as I love red wine, and I know that there's a lot of people, certainly in England, who still think that red wine is, the first duty of wine is to be red,
Right.
and they think that white wine is what? Why would you drink that? But I love the kind of, I know this is a word that people hate, but the minerality, as in the non-fruitness
Right.
of shedding. It's not a fruity wine. It's kind of a wine that enlivens your mouth, your palate, and the best. People like Richard Loire, who I write about in the book, or Stéphane Bernardeau. I love the freshness and the cut of those wines.
Right.
Yeah, they just kind of just yeah give you a buzz, give me a
Yeah,
buzz.
they're very interesting. I mean, they're memorable too,
Mm,
and they're like you said, there are a lot of good producers. Um, Coming towards the end of talking about some of the chapters, I think you do a good job bringing up. I'm telling you, you did a good job.
thank
The
you.
fact that you, but it sounds a little silly. The fact that you discuss two regions that make wonderful wines and hardly exposed to most people are
Mm,
Switzerland, where the wines barely get out of the country, and the
yeah,
Savoie in France, which have been making great wines.
yeah.
A lot of people don't know about them. Um,
Mm.
do you feel they're getting their due? Is distribution, to all parts, north, south, east, west, getting better? And, tell me a little about these wines. Start with
Yeah,
Switzerland.
yeah. Well, I went to Switzerland because I didn't know anything really about Switzerland apart from it's very hard to find the wines in the UK. And the reason for that is that they're good and the Swiss don't really need to sell them to anyone else, so they keep them.
It's
But it
crazy.
was, going there, and one of the things I really love about my job is being able to go somewhere and just get a flight there, not know too much about it, and just go and make a few appointments and find out about, well, what is it, what is it first of all, what makes it great, why are the people doing what they do, and to really feel their passion. So, I knew that Marie Therese Chapaz is the leading winemaker in the Valais. So she's a real inspirational character. So I had a tasting with her, which is fantastic. She makes a lot of different wines. She has these crazy vineyards. They're so steep. They're so steep. You can't walk up into them. You have to go with her in a cable car.
Oh,
So
God.
there's one called the Amphitheater of Hell, which is quite literally as
It's
it sounds.
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So And to be able to go there and to be able to kind of have a tolerance for not knowing about where you're going. I think it's something I refer to in the book that the poet Keats talks about as having negative capability. So if you're able to do that without always having to quantify everything and know and try and put facts, then it's just a really illuminating kind of experience. And I love those wines because her whites, especially, which the wines that I really love of hers, they can be quite full bodied and gourmand and voluptuous, a bit like those Northern Rhone wines.
Right.
And actually, the fact that where she is the upper Northern Rhone, so you're talking miles north, but it's a continuation of the same kind of bit of land. And yeah, it was beautiful going there and discovering Petit Arvin, which I'd never had before. This grape, and I know that other producers like I know Chapoutier and Gaia, they tried to plant that grape in the Northern Rhone and in Barbaresco because they fell in love with it too. But this kind of rich but beautifully pure wine. But it was a great experience going to Switzerland. And Marie Thérèse, she sent me off to this place called Chateau de Villa, and it's the kind of the best place, she said, to go and eat raclette. And they're obsessed by raclette in Switzerland. Yeah, they love it. I mean, you talk to anybody from the taxi driver to the hotel receptionist, and talk to them about food, and it soon comes back to raclette. He says you've got to go try raclette at Chateau de Villa. So I'm sitting there with our photographer, and we got given this huge wine list. It was like being at La Tour d'Argent. It was like hundreds and hundreds of wines.
Yeah.
And I looked through, and I knew one name on that wine list, and that was hers. And it took me back to, no matter how much you think you know about wine, a drop in the ocean, and to be able to remain humble and open-minded, have a kind of childlike openness to new experience, I think is vital for really exploring wine.
Sure. Now tell me about the Savoie, a little different, mountain wines, but a little different kind of style, right?
Yeah, and the producers that I saw there, they were quite a long way from each other. There was a guy called Adrien Vallier who we've just started to work with, and he makes such a tiny kind of production from like quite young vineyards that just not much of it is ever going to come to the UK. Yeah. But Domaine Ardoisier, I was really, really impressed with. And for me, that's like when people come to the restaurants and they want a Savoie wine that's reliable and just, harmonious.
Spell the wine for me.
Ardoisier, Domaine, I'd have to Google that. It's
right, send it to me.
I will do. It's in the book.
I'll look in the book. Okay. I totally forgot of the book right in front of me. But I just want people, you hear one thing and you're not sure what you hear.
And then there's Vin du Paradis as well, which is a bit further north, a bit further north. Again, really interesting area. I was there for like 2 days, a year and a half, 2 years ago. So I want to go back and learn more about it because it's quite
that's diverse. A great thing to feel that way. It's always open.
But I drove from Switzerland to Savoie, and nice. For listeners that want to do something different, I think that's a great trip to drive through the mountains and round all the mountain passes and end up, where the ski resorts. Some of these people, where Adrien Vallier is, he's near Chamonix, I think, or not too far away. So
pretty nice.
Yeah.
All right, I could go on and on and on. That's my short list. Before we move on, is there any wine maker chapter in the book that you want to bring up? You don't have to. I just, are you so compelled, before?
Well, one wine region that's on my mind is Chianti, because I'm organizing a trip to go back there in 10 days' time.
Okay.
And I know that, a lot of wine culture gets a beating for being expensive and, like we've talked about. But for me, Chianti represents such a great opportunity for people just getting into wine. and people who are deep into wine to drink beautifully made wines for not stupid money. And I'm really looking forward to going back and seeing people like Tenuta Di Carleone, who I write about in the book, and
Right.
Val de Corte and Montevertine.
Yeah.
And I've kind of done a bit more investigation and to find some of the more up and coming producers. But I love Sangiovese when it's made with a light hand, and I'm really excited to go back there. It would be
Now,
the second
when
time.
you say when you say Chianti, are we
Yeah.
talking every level, Chianti, Classico, Reserva, or are you kind of
Yeah, I mean,
focusing in on a particular?
Chianti Classico and
Is really
also
the sweet spot, right?
yeah, and then some of these producers then make wines outside the appellation as well, but they're all around kind of that area and Rada and those kind of towns. But
Right. I
some
agree with you on that. And I'll tell you another guy, and I brought it up to him. I told you I had Eric Asimov on a couple of weeks ago. He's been
mm,
obsessed with Chianti for 10
mm,
years. I mean, he
mm,
writes about it twice a year, and he's not wrong. All right. Before we move on to the wine list, I want to ask you one last question, and it ties
mm.
into your life experience and all that, the book, everything you do. In writing the books and the restaurants, importing and all that. You met many winemakers. Has there been, one or two that has just had such an effect on you? I'll answer that first, and then you go. I would say Gravner because you brought him up 2, 3 times. I would say Rouleau because he launched your. Besides being a great winemaker and a great guy, he helped launch the import business. But tell me, through writing the book, through running the restaurants, writing in the magazine, are there a couple of people that just have had this effect on you?
Well, yeah, so many. I mean, another person whose wines I drink a lot is Jean-Marie Guffins,
Yes.
and he's an iconoclast and somebody. I love this idea of an outsider who comes to another region and kind of overperforms on lesser vineyards, and which is exactly what he did in the Macanay. So I think his wines are just exceptional, and they're just go-tos. And Guffins is he's an outspoken character, to put it politely, but he's he ruffled a lot of feathers, but he's at the end of the day he is a dreamer, and he's got a good heart, and he makes just world-class wine. So that idea of the outsider, yeah, and that's kind of, there's other people trying to think of who the other outsiders are, but I mean, there's plenty of people that have come to Burgundy. People like Katerina Sade, who's come and makes really lovely wines,
Yes.
or who else in Burgundy? There's quite a few of them. People that come from all around the world to follow their passion. I'm always
Right.
very impressed by that. That
Yeah.
people, Frank Cornelis, and I've always been inspired by, for the same reason that he moved from Belgium and then
Right.
decided quite crazily to
To
do his
Sicily.
wine on the side of Etna.
Yeah. And
I'm
terrific.
impressed by anybody who makes wine on Etna, but he kind of went there with an idea and not really the training to make wine. He said he wanted to make liquid rock, and he wanted to make the anti-wine, as in he wanted to make the anti-technologically made wines.
Right.
And when I started drinking them, and I started drinking them with Mark, my business partner, they were quite a lot of the time, wow, they're probably faulty, and they'd have these kind of lumps of rock in them that we thought was
Right.
lava, and they'd look like they were kind of like glowing, kind of nuclear pink. But the wines have got a lot better, but it's going back to this idea of the philosophy of the wine. And his philosophy, he put his principles front and center, and he did it with poetry as well. And I love that.
Yeah.
Freddie Mounier, as a person, he's very humble, very thoughtful. Soldera, I never got to meet, and I
He
had
recently passed, right? In the past year or
yeah,
two. Yeah.
it was a few years ago, and I had a meeting, a tasting in with him, and he had an accident, and he ended up in Milan hospital. So I met
Yeah.
his daughter. But when I heard, how meticulous he was in the winery, these insane levels of meticulousness
Yeah.
that
The
really
wines are
manifested themselves. Yeah, I mean,
the
those
wines
wines
are
for me
amazing. All
yeah, they
right, those
just
are all. You went way beyond. You gave me some great stuff. All right, let's wrap this show up. It's been a while. I got to get you out of here, but I won't let you go without doing our wine list. The wine list
Yeah.
is a series of 5 questions, the same 5 questions we've asked our last 300 guests. You pried me to give you the questions. I said no, so you have to answer these spontaneously. So the first question is, what are you drinking now? And I put that in the context of what's in your fridge? What are you curious about? Do you have to drink stuff for the import company, the restaurant? Just, what's in front of you these days?
Yeah, I mean, I'm drinking a Guffen's wine actually, Macon Pierre Clos and Saint Veran, and I got given a couple of cases by a friend of mine, and they have been just a complete joy to be working through over the last couple of weeks. Tonight we've got a very special dinner. It was a competition we ran for the book, and it's in our Soho restaurant where 2 competition winners bring in 2 friends, and we're going to drink a selection of wines from the book, including a bottle of Duveau Blanchet, the Von Romanet Premier Cru from Domaine de la Romani Conti. So that's tonight, but that is not something we drink very often at all. And
you're drinking that now.
During that dinner, we got a magnum of Hermitage from Marie Therese Chapaz. So that wine from the mountains. Got an old Montevertine 2006. What else are we going to have?
I think it's fair to say, I mean, you just named 3, 4, 5, incredible wines. That's what you're drinking now. You answered the question properly, but I would guess you're a moving target. Every week what you're drinking now is something pretty interesting and different. True?
Absolutely. I mean, we're never drinking, it could be Bordeaux, it could be Italian, it could be Spanish, sherry. I mean, obviously, 82 Trevelyan drank the other day, just an amazing wine. I mean, we're very lucky, but having 3 restaurants and an import business, you're
what are you drinking now? Your door is way more open, than the average person listening to this. All right, second question. Goofiest question of the 5. Favorite wine and food pairing? Listen, you're a restaurateur. You became a gourmand. All I care about is your favorite wine and food pairing, not what you and I think is the ultimate one. What do you like? It's something obviously you don't eat, that often. But what's that wine and food pairing?
Yeah, I mean, the one that I would come back to if I could have anything would be grouse, and it would be with an aged Northern Rhone or Burgundy. And that could kind of alter, but I think that kind of, you get those old bottles that kind of smell a bit like grouse anyway, and then they'll have elements of grouse.
Yeah.
And, I know that in America, grouse is very hard to come by. I probably have to import it. And it's a wine that's kind of, I mean, a food that is very seasonal and I think very special. So I'd have that with some bread sauce and maybe an old Chave Hermitage from the 80s or the 70s.
Sounds good. You're so British with that grouse answer, and you explained why. Help me out, because I'm not a huge grouse eater, but if you had to equate grouse to something possibly familiar, what is it like? It's not a Cornish hen. It's not pigeon. What would you say it's like?
Oh, well, it's kind of irony. It's got an irony taste to it.
Okay.
It has a funk to it. It's
Is it mostly dark meat?
It's dark, but sometimes, and also it very much depends on how long the bird has been hung for.
Right.
So some people like to hang it for a long time, and it becomes very high. It gets high, and then some people like to not cook it very much. So, I remember, on one occasion in a restaurant having a hardly cooked bird that was It was so
Oh
stinky.
God.
I'm not a fan of when it gets really, really stinky. I like it like maybe
Yeah.
2, 3, 4 weeks after grouse season starts. So it
Right.
has it has some of that flavor, but it has a harmony to it, like the wine, hopefully.
Yeah, the aged Northern Rhone and
Yeah,
Burgundies can hold
yeah.
up. All right, I have to tell you that maybe of the 300 wine lists we did, the only grouse entry. So kudos to you.
Oh, brilliant.
All right, so here's the third question. Let me read the question first, and then I want to set it up for you. The question is, Dan, what's your favorite wine restaurant and or bar? Okay, don't answer that yet. So what you do at Noble Rot is the top of the list for a question like that. Okay.
Mm,
And the question, points towards tell me places that have a great wine list, that have great people serving it, that have a vibe. There's good food there. They're just doing it right. So I don't want to put you on the spot because the first thing I said is Noble Rot.
mm.
But are there other places, and maybe we stay out of London, maybe in your travels? Answer. And the other thing I say is this is not your top 5 list, 3 list, 2. This isn't your favorite. These are just some suggestions of people that I alluded to, that do it right.
Yeah.
Anything come to mind in your travels?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking London, there's two places that come straight to mind. One is Chez Bruce, which is, I think, my favourite restaurant in the capital. The only fault I can find with it is that it's in Wandsworth, which is a long way away from where I am.
Okay.
But it's a guy called Bruce Paul's the chef, and he's such an accomplished kind of brilliant cook. He used to work for people like Simon Hopkinson, who's
Got it.
yeah, he's from that kind of school of Rowley Lee. People that their food was called modern British, and what that kind of meant, I think, was their interpretations of great dishes from predominantly from Europe, but really beautiful food. But the wine list is from his partner. Well, I think the older wine's from his partner, a guy called Nigel Platts Martin, and he has built an enviable cellar of really,
Really?
really great wines. That they do that old school restaurateur thing of buying them on release years ago,
Right. And
aging
holding
them,
them.
and yeah,
Yeah.
and then putting them on the list for like very reasonable margins.
Love that.
So at the bottom of the list, there's always interesting things. At the top of the list, there's bargains. So it's a double whammy, and it's just on the kind of Wandsworth Common, which is nice. It feels like you're out of the very centre of London, but
Right.
I would highly recommend that to anybody
That's
who
a
comes
great
to
one. You
London
said
from
you had another
America.
one?
Yeah, and a very different vibe, but over in Haggerston in East London, a place called Plonk,
Right.
and it's a kind of more modern design. The owner's a guy called Jonathan, and he's built a fantastic cellar. Lots of kind of esoteric kind of French, Italian wines. I mean, not just, but
Right.
it's kind of if you want Savoy wines, for example, he would be the man to go to get them. And the food's very good. It's a nice kind of room, and yeah, nice people. So
So
those, yeah.
th- those are good ones. So let me ask you a question. Either you come to New York a lot and you never call me, or you rarely come here, which is my guess. I mean, are you traveling mostly for wine, or
Yeah, mostly for
when
wine.
was the
So
last time you were in New York?
last year, because I went to the designers that did the book. They
Oh,
are
okay.
they're
That
in
was kind of a
Manhattan.
business trip.
Yeah, and I was
Yeah.
pretty ill as well. So when you get on those long transatlantic flights or go to Australia, then
Oh God.
the virus is done off go round. But yeah, I mean, I went to a few places, but it was not one of the most hedonistic trips, put it that way.
Yeah. Makes sense. Because
Yeah.
I just don't hear or see you being in New York. I know how busy you are. So, all right, let's get to the fourth question. The fourth question is favorite all time wine. The initial intent of that question was, Dan, you're around wine a lot. What was the most expensive rare wine you drank? Don't give a crap about that. Tell me about a wine or two that beyond Gateway changed the way you think about wine. We'll put that Trimbach Riesling in there. But tell me other wines that were important, still memorable, opened up your eyes. Do you have a couple?
Oh, all the time. I mean, it's constant. This having your eyes open, and it keeps you coming back for more. And if you don't have those experiences, I think your passion might wane. Although it doesn't seem to. I mean, just recently I went round a friend's house and he very generously opened a bottle of '96 Giacomo Conterno Monfortino Barolo, which had this kind of it had a lot of VA, this kind of vinegary kind of smell, but it was in just perfect balance, and it gave the wine such complexity. And it was just one of those moments that really kind of took me
Did
away.
the
So
vinegary blow off a little?
yeah, it did, and I say that in a really positive
Yeah,
way
no, I
because
figured that.
I think VA is as we know it's the vigneron's enemy, and if you allow it to take hold of a wine, it just ruins it.
Right.
But with this particular wine, it just added energy and complexity to it. I felt the same thing about some Solera vintages as well.
Yeah.
Um, you know, Reyes 78. I mean,
Well, Reyes can always make the list.
and I've been very lucky to have some wines from the 30s recently. 34 Cheval Blanc. I mean, these are all like lofty bottles, so
Bordeaux?
people are just gonna.
The
Sorry,
34s? The
30,
34s were Bordeaux?
yeah, 34 Cheval Blanc, 34
Oh,
Vieux
good.
Chateau Sertan as well. Both
So to
incredible.
that point, was 34 considered a good vintage?
Yeah, and
Okay.
and
And
they
they're still showing well?
beyond well.
All
Both of
right.
them were just
All right. I
sensational.
didn't mention to you, that's my dog barking in the background. I didn't mention to you, I think the UPS guy is here. I didn't mention to you that I post these answers on social media so that, we can expose them to our listeners. I mean, the whole fun thing to me is getting a guy like you to talk about the book, Talk Wine, and then because you're so deeply embedded, to get some recommendations, which comes to my last question. And you may be the most qualified guy I've ever spoken to answer this question because of what you do. And the question is, recommend to me the best wines around 15, 20, 22 bucks American, English pounds, not much different. Red and a white. You can go category, like if you drink the right Muscadets, they're inexpensive and they're terrific. So give me some recommendations. And I always tell
Yeah,
people one of the reasons I put this question on the list is I have kids like in their 20s and early 30s, and they still don't know much about wine. So if I could
yeah,
feed them some of your answers, they could show up at
yeah.
a party or a dinner and not with a crappy wine and not too expensive. So
So
tell me
what's the
what you're
budget?
thinking.
What does it go up to?
15, 20, 22 bucks. That's low and I made it hard, but get close to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I won't do chin chin because that's just cheating and you can't get
No,
it
no,
in
I want
America
to do
anyway.
chin chin. Is it available in the U.S.?
No, it's not.
Okay, so
So,
when you're in England, when you're in London, you go to Noble Rot, try Chin Chin, and look for it at the store. I will
yeah,
take that for sure.
exactly.
And that kind of fits the category perfectly. I mean, the wine
Yeah.
that varietal, that region offers great value for great price for great quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think Muscadet, I would go for Domaine de la Pepier.
Yep,
And I think that they're kind of entry level cuvées are exceptional.
yep.
I love their wines, and they're very affordable. They're not high alcohol. They're very refreshing. They're not going to knock you over the head and make you feel bad. They're conscientiously
I
made.
agree.
And
What about a red? Little harder.
um, It is a bit harder, but I'm thinking Beaujolais, and I'm thinking some of the entry level wines from some of the best producers there, people like Julien Saunier,
Okay.
or we work with a guy called Philippe Viette.
Spell.
But I'm not sorry,
Spell Philip's last name.
Viet.
Oh, Viet. Okay.
Yeah, and yeah. So I would head to Beaujolais. I mean, I don't know what the price of some of these Chiantis are like in the States, but I love Tenuta di Carleone's entry level wine as well, and I think that
It may
they're
tickle that range. It may be
yeah.
around there. Worth
I
looking
mean,
for.
they're an absolute steal for the money, you know.
I'm
So
definitely going to post that. Like I said, I'm
yeah,
going to post it. All right, so
yeah.
those are good ones. We don't have to, go too crazy. I just wanted some recos. All right, Daniel, we have to wrap up the show. Let me do a quick wrap up, and then I want to get some very specific information from you for our listeners. So if you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Listen to the Grape Nation podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your pods. Please subscribe to the Grape Nation on any of those platforms and leave a review if you like the podcast. Follow us on Instagram at sbenruby, on X at benruby, no S there. You can always use the hashtag the Grape Nation to find us on either of those. We're on Facebook at the Grape Nation. As I mentioned, we'll post Dan's wine list on our social media sites. Some great recos there. Plus, during the course of the show, we talked about a lot of terrific wines and winemakers. Give my listeners some info. Dan, in your mind, where is the best place to order Who's Afraid of Romani Conti?
Well, you can order it from www.noblerock.co.uk
Okay.
or Amazon, Barnes and Noble. All those
Okay.
shops have it in the States as well. So, yeah.
Okay. So basically, it's out there.
Yeah.
We can go direct to you, support your local booksellers, but it's available in other places.
Yeah.
What about Noble Rot, the magazine?
So yeah, I mean, we have you can subscribe to the magazine from the States. Also, we've got a lot of stockists in America. There's quite a few in New York.
Right.
Places like Hart and Crew over in the middle of the country, and a few on the West Coast as well. Well, there's a list of places on our website.
Okay, so go to the website for that. Tell me quickly about Shrine to the Vine. That's a walk-in retail operation?
Yeah, so we've got two shops. We've got the first shop opened on Lamb's Conduit Street, nearly opposite our first restaurant. And then we've got another one in Broadway Market, which is London Fields, which is kind of Hackney. But yeah, they are the retail arm of our import company.
Okay.
So a lot of our agencies, we will put wines in the shop as well, and limited edition bottles and stuff like that. Do a lot of offers of aged wine and mature wines, so you can sign up for offers. And yeah,
So
UK wide
the good news is you're representing a lot of great people, so that's reflected in the store. That ain't a bad deal, right?
Yeah, and there'll be some of these domains won't make a lot of wine, and we'll have consignments that we'll send out an offer, and they'll be sold out like 10 minutes later. So if you want to get on those wines, then sign up.
And you have the import company, which we kind of worked into that, and then the restaurants. There's three of them. The original Soho.
Yeah. So the original's on Lamb's Conduit Street, and that was built in 1701. It's our most historic building, but we're really into historic buildings. So they've all got this, oldie worldy London vibe to them, which, we obviously used to go to, and we do go to Paris a lot. And, part of the inspiration was some of those bistros that we used to eat in a lot. And got a bit depressed because obviously London has been bombed a lot more than Paris, which hadn't been bombed during the Second World War. So we never thought we would find something with the kind of feel that we wanted, but we've been fortunate enough to find three properties. The second is in Soho on Greek Street, and it was an iconic London restaurant called the Gay Hussar, which was...
I remember reading about that, yeah.
Yeah, it was a real favourite of politicians and journalists. And people like Gordon Brown, the old Prime Minister, used to do strategy meetings there.
Right.
And it's just beautiful inside. It's like being in an old train carriage, like the Orient Express, I always think. There's a long, thin room that's wood panelled. So that's a brilliant restaurant. And then the other one is in Shepherd Market. And Shepherd Market is an enclave of Mayfair, and it was known for, it was the red light area of Mayfair. So, there'd be a lot of blokes with bowler hats back in the day waiting outside doorways for dubious goings on. But it's got a real great atmosphere to Shepherd Market. It's kind of got a bit of dirt under its fingernails.
Yeah, they are. I've yet to get into any one of them because I haven't been to the
You should
UK,
come.
and I know. I trust me. Since the last time I spoke to you, I've yet to be there,
Mhm.
but I will meet up with you one day. Where can we find you on social media, or any of these
At
other things?
Noble, yeah, at Noble Rock Mag
Okay.
is my Instagram handle. At Noble Rock Bar is our Lamb's Conduit Street restaurant as well. And then there's at Shrine to the Vine and at
Okay.
Keeling Andrew. So yeah,
Okay. All right. So everyone take note of that. Dan, thank you for coming on the Grape Nation. Thank you for when I reached out, you got right back to me and showed some nice enthusiasm about coming on a second time. Um, I think the book is wonderful. I've
thank you.
had some good people talk about some good books in the last 2-3 months. Pascaline, A Thousand Vines, Kelly White did a book, a few other things. So I love this book. I think your writing is very interesting. I think you're very expressive, you're imaginative, certainly intelligent, and you're a captivating wine writer. So congrats to you on the book and continued success
Thank you.
with everything. Good health. Don't forget to take care of yourself. I want to thank our engineer, Armin, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam Van Ruby, and you have been listening to The Grape Nation.
The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.